So things just got crazier. France, they are in trouble, and Macron just ran to China to save his economy because things in Paris are really getting from bad to worse. We have the pension protest still going on, and Macron has no choice but to travel to Beijing or face a collapse of the entire system. They are even targeting his favorite bistro. Things are getting real serious on the streets when they are targeting your favorite cafe. Now, France is facing a pension crisis. You quickly realize why Macron cannot afford to decouple with China. All this talk from the EU exiting China is being resisted by Macron because he knows the truth. The world is slipping into recession, and without China, the Eurozone will be in a world of financial pain. And that's why he's breaking away from the American positioning of labeling Beijing as the enemy. And let's recap the pension crisis in France because we truly need to understand this first. And there are two things we need to take note of. Now, firstly, Macron is looking to reform the pension system. He wants to increase the retirement age by 2 years to 64. So if you're a French citizen, you might have to work for 2 more years before you can access the state pension system. And that means working longer and contributing more money to the pension scheme before you can access a minimum of 1,200 euros a month. That's not very much money at all. You're effectively losing 2 years of income and paying 2 more years of pension contributions. And that's why people are just so angry. And just think about how much more purchasing power you will lose in just 2 years in today's inflation hell. But if France doesn't impose the reforms, the pension deficit will reach more than $13 billion annually by 2027. And this means to sustain the pension system, France will have to conduct huge deficit spending to fund the scheme. And that means borrowing huge amounts of money at a much higher interest rate today. Now, back in 2020, the French 10-year bonds were at a negative yield. And this meant that France actually made money from investors by selling government bonds. But today, the story is very different. The 10-year French yield is above 2.7%, which makes it extremely expensive to borrow money. The French debt is reaching 3 trillion euros and is well above 110% of their GDP, but spending isn't going down fast enough. So France can't really afford to borrow more money at higher interest rates. And this of course means Macron cannot afford for his economy to collapse. He cannot afford higher unemployment, which means decoupling from China is nearly impossible. And we have to understand how fragile France's pension system is. All this talk about reforms and workers retiring years later all depends on one big assumption, and that is if French workers still have jobs down the line. Like Germany, France is now facing a big industrialization threat, a big crisis. And it's all stemmed from the energy problem, the big energy crisis. And let's recall what happened over the last year. France is part of the G7 coalition that imposed brutal sanctions on Russian energy. And did it hurt Russian revenues? Yes, it did. But it also boomeranged back and slapped France in the face as well. And you see, France has been deindustrializing for a long time now. We can see since 2000, France's share of the Eurozone's industrial sector has been dropping from 19% down to under 14%. And this is a continuous slide down that shows us that French manufacturing has been collapsing for decades. And with higher energy costs, their industries are under greater pressure. But the story gets worse. France is facing an export crunch because the world is moving towards a recession. We have France's manufacturing sector contracting in February, reaching a multi-month low. So France is getting squeezed, and to keep their pension system afloat, they cannot afford higher unemployment. And the Bank of France is projecting unemployment up to 7.5% in 2023 and 8.2% in 2024. And this is why France is pivoting towards China. They know their pension system will be in big trouble if unemployment rises. They need cheap access to Chinese chip manufacturing base while selling more stuff to the Chinese. They need both of this. If we look closer at the French pension system, we can see it's a disaster just waiting to implode. The system works only if there are enough active workers who are contributing to the pension schemes. It's basically the younger generation subsidizing the old. And if enough people stop paying into the system, the whole scheme could collapse. And this is the biggest fear Macron has. In the 1960s, there were 4 working contributors to every 1 pensioner. But today, 50 years on, this number has shrunk to just 1.7 workers for every pensioner. So just imagine if unemployment flies up. there'll be fewer contributions, and the pension crisis could get much worse. And this is the main reason why Macron made the trip to China. He basically did the same thing that Olaf Scholz back in December last year. Macron, he traveled with the 50-strong delegation of French business leaders, and we are talking about the CEOs of Airbus, Alstom, and EDF. And these are manufacturing and industry giants that understand the importance of the Chinese market and why it is crazy to decouple. And the approach that EU took with France was the classic good cop and bad cop routine, which the Chinese obviously saw a mile away. It was basically Macron acting like the good guy, talking mainly about business and why the EU must continue relations with China. He specifically told the world that we mustn't decouple with China. And the bad cop routine was played by von der Leyen, telling everyone that the Eurozone needs to de-risk with China. It's a bipolar approach that is quite hilarious to watch. And this is how crazy things got. Von der Leyen told China how important it is to the EU before launching into a harsh critique. She mentioned how our economies are strongly interconnected, but the EU trade deficit is increasing due to unfair practices. I mean, just look at the caption and the first part of her speech. It feels like they were written by two completely different people. And that's why when you see the picture of President Xi with the EU leaders, von der Leyen looks like she was cut and pasted into the photo. She is standing so far apart from Macron and Xi. Plus, if you just look at the seating arrangement between Xi, Macron and von der Leyen, it looks like the EU leaders are attending a job interview. It's just very strange optics. But if you analyze China's treatment of France, we can see it is much more welcoming, intimate, and much warmer. And I made a mistake when I said Macron was going to China for dim sum, but it turned out to be Chinese tea. And this tells us the importance China places on relations with France, because the real agenda of the trip was purely about business. We need to see this for what it really is. It's mainly just a business trip with von der Leyen tagging along. She's just a plus one. And if we analyze the economic victories from this trip, the underlying message is quite clear. France is growing closer to China, and Xi is happy to do more business with France. They signed major economic agreements, and these are very big deals that we need to talk about. We have a big Airbus deal with the company moving to open a new assembly plant in China. And this is going to double their production capacity, which will allow France to keep winning in the Chinese market. And this underscores a very different narrative about the Chinese market, especially when it comes to air travel, which is rebounding fast. According to the Airbus CEO, the recovery here is quite impressive. We see very strong momentum. And this is why France can't decouple from China. They want to benefit from China's recovery, from their reopening, and sign as many deals as possible. Remember that France needs to keep their employment levels high to prevent their pension system from imploding. And that means they need a lot of Chinese money to buy their stuff, but more importantly, they need access to cheap energy and manufacturing from China. We're also seeing deals from their energy companies EDF and China Energy when it comes to nuclear and wind power. And this tells us how important China is to the Eurozone. And in previous videos, we talk about how Germany's trip to China is just the beginning. It's the start of a wave of European nations flocking to Beijing. Germany might have been the first, but France is definitely not the last. And China has a tremendous advantage over Europe thanks to its economic alliance with Russia. China is already the world's manufacturing giant, and when you add in cheap energy from Putin, this gives China a tremendous economic advantage that no country can surpass. The EU diplomats have admitted that they need China more than ever, and guess what? It all revolves around energy. And no matter how you slice and dice things, Europe needs the Chinese economy. And listen to this admission, sanctions against Russia increase energy prices. Our goal is to transition from Russian gas to renewable. A big part of that is quickly getting a hold of cheap solar panels. And who makes cheap solar panels? China. We cannot shut out our original energy source and our new one at the same time. Macron's trip to China just underscores the economic reality. Europe is realizing they are stuck between the United States and China. I want to highlight the recent study from the Pew Research Center that tells us how Europe views China today. And if you didn't know, the Research Center is one of the less biased publications that care more about facts than feelings. No publication is truly neutral, but this is as good as it gets. And in this survey, they asked young adults in Germany, France, and the UK about their opinions about the United States and China, and the results are quite interesting. It's quite astonishing. Overall, they stated that the US is seen as the world's policeman with a self-interested history of interventionism that is disappointing to Western allies, while China is labeled as the world's factory, respected for its economic dominance but strongly criticized for its expansionism and record of human rights violation. But let's focus on China's economic strength. Respondents from all three countries surveyed viewed China as the top economy, beating even the United States. 55% from Germany said China was number one. France and the UK also viewed China as a stronger competitor than the US. It gets even more interesting when asked about China's manufacturing power. The majority of young Europeans views it as inescapable. And here's one comment that really stood out. If you want to achieve something, you'll need China for sure. At the end of the day, for better or for worse, Europe considers China the world's factory. And this tells us that people within the EU, they are very aware of the economic situation. It's just not feasible to decouple. And now that you have Russia and China forming an economic alliance, the gateway to cheap Russian energy is through Beijing. There's truly no other way. If we look carefully at China's interactions with Europe, it is the same strategy. They will first listen to all the talk about human rights or ending the war in Ukraine. Then it's time to talk business and then sign a few deals. At the end of the day, China is keeping the lines of communication open. Europe is flying over to sign a few deals, pointing the finger with a few criticisms, and everyone leaves happy at the end of the day. And what France is doing is very smart. They're actually decoupling away from the West and diversifying into a region that's becoming independent from the Western financial system. And this is why we are seeing Saudi Arabia pouring billions into building refineries on Chinese soil. Sure, China is getting cheap energy from Russia, that's 100% true, but it goes beyond just energy, it goes beyond just oil. It actually has more to do with how strong China's economy is becoming. And a perfect example is the SVB banking crisis. While the rest of the financial system was in crisis mode, when three banks in America collapsed, China's banks had close to zero damage. And according to the Atlantic Council, which is an American think tank, they admitted that the Chinese banking system was more resilient, ironically because it has more state control. And of all the financial institutions in the world, China had the most state ownership at 39% compared to France, which sits at just 4.6%, or America, which is only at 0.2%. Yes, American banks are technically more free market, but that doesn't mean they are being run more effectively. Since the start of the SVB collapse, the banking performance of the G7 countries collapsed like a rock, falling by over 10% easily. China, however, was much different. It dropped by a few percentage points initially, then rebounded back to normal, back to the baseline, like nothing even happened. And this is the perfect example of why countries are looking to invest in China. It is run differently, and it has many unique advantages that Europe or America doesn't. And this is why we are seeing France run to China. And they won't be the last European country to do so. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Which country is next to visit China? Can Europe really afford to decouple? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.